Good afternoon, everybody. I think we have our critical mass from the committee. So welcome to the Public Safety and Government Operations Committee meeting. I want to encourage folks from the committee and also from the agencies to keep your cameras on if you can for transparency. In attendance, we have myself, Chair of the committee from the 4th District, Councilman Burnett from the 8th District, Councilman Cohen from the 1st District. Councilman Costello is running a little bit late. Councilman Glover will not be attending today. He's feeling under the weather. Councilwoman Porter from the 10th District is here. And Councilwoman Ramos from the 14th District is here as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. From the Office of the President, do you have Nikki Thompson on the line?
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Nikki. Matt Stegman and Aaron DeGraffenreich. All right, and representing the mayor's office, do I have Natasha? I see Natasha on the line.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Anina Demelis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. All right, so this afternoon, the committee will have a hearing for Bill 21-0050, Burglar Alarms, Registration and Regulation, False Alarms, for the purpose of revising the fees assessed to alarm system users for repeated false alarms, altering the number of false alarms within the year that will result in the placement of the premises on a no response status, requiring that the alarm system monitors make certain additional attempts to verify the need for police response, making certain stylistic changes, and providing for a special effective date. This bill was introduced on March 22nd, 2021, and was sponsored by the Council President on behalf of the administration. I want to open the floor to the administration of the mayor's office, and I believe PPD who brought this bill forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On behalf of the mayor's office, Natasha Mayer here, just to set the stage with a couple of brief points on this false alarm legislation. So false burglar alarms present a significant drain on police time and resources. Every false alarm an officer responds to takes away that officer from responding to potential real crimes happening elsewhere in the city. So to address this problem, we are looking to make sure there's more efficient use of our police officers' time and resources while ensuring that the alarm program remain effective for residents as well. The goal of this bill is to better help change the behavior by strengthening compliance in order to reduce those false alarms. So right now, the city has a pretty high threshold by which a user is placed on a no response list. And that is 15 false alarms. This bill would bring that down to 5 false alarms in which we'd be placed on a no response list, bring the city closer in line to a number of jurisdictions. The bill does retain and strengthen some of the provisions required for notice to ensure that an alarm user is notified that they would be put on this no response list and given time and procedures which currently exist in law in order to fix the reason that they're having the false alarm problem. There are also provisions that allow for waivers of the first false alarm fee. And ultimately, this is all to ensure that we're best using our resources, that we're not responding to multiple false alarms in one year period, and ensuring that our officers can be more effectively deployed to non-false alarm situations. And so with that, I'll close my remarks and turn it over.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. For the record, my name is Michelle Wurzberger, and I'm the Director of Government Affairs for the Baltimore Police Department. For this bill, we are joined by Eric Melanson, who is the Chief of Staff for the department, and he's going to tell you a little bit more details about why we are very much in support of this bill. Eric?
Thank you, Michelle, and I want to first thank the administration for their support of this effort.
I also want to just thank the council president for authoring the bill, and of course you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing it forward today. For us, this is a key issue in determining how workload on our officers is just better managed. Part of what we want to make sure in responding to calls for service is that our officers are responding in a timely fashion and that they're available for emergencies that arise throughout the city on a regular basis. And so for us, anything that takes away from that, anything that pulls an officer away from a real emergency becomes a concern on that officer's capacity to be able to respond to actual emergencies. False alarms are something that are a concern because we know that it represents a burden. We're looking at thousands of these that occur on an annual basis. And we know that if there is something that we can change, something we can modify that better helps the department and better helps the city, manage this effort together, we want to be able to do that in partnership. And so again, I want to thank the administration and the council president for bringing this bill forward. For us, we're available to answer questions. A couple of key points about the non-response status. I want to be very clear on what that means and what that does not mean. A non-response status means that for automatic activations for which an alarm company is monitoring an address, where they send it directly to 911 and then we dispatch a unit, those are the kinds of calls we're talking about. If there is a manual activation that an alarm user, a resident or a business owner hits a panic alarm, we will always, as a department, respond to those emergencies, even if that premises is in a non-response status for the automatic side. We want to make sure that we're responding to actual emergencies and evidence of that, be it through video or through manual activation. That is something we take very seriously. That does not get impacted by this legislation or any changes to it. And so, and I'll just end on a note of, again, call reduction, looking at our calls for service volume. This is one of many initiatives that the mayor's office is partnering with BPD on in helping to ensure that call reduction or call diversion or ways that we can free up that time that officers spend is vital for us. We want to make sure our officers are more available for proactive engagement, community engagement, and again, making certain that our laws and our ordinances are in a place where we have the best ability to do that. That's what this legislation is really about. And so for us, we're available to answer questions. We are in strong support of this legislation. I also want to thank, of course, the housing department that helps us, administer this program, and that's very key for us. And so, again, any questions that the committee may have, we're welcome to answer those.
Thank you. We're going to move on actually to committee reports or agency reports. Please state your name before you speak up, and I'll start with the law department.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. It's Elena DePietro from the City Law Department. I wanted to make a correction to my report before I move into the rest of it. I assumed, because all of our conversations around this have dealt with most of the police department, that the commissioner was referring to the police commissioner, but in fact, the commissioner is defined as the housing commissioner. So there's a little paragraph in my bill report that discusses that, so that can be disregarded, and I will file an amended report. But otherwise, we approved the bill for form and legal sufficiency. The one item that I do want to mention that was part of a supplemental report that did not make it online is that this refers to these charges as fees, but in reality, they are really more like fines. And that has some significant consequences in determining how much you can charge. Like if there's the taxes, fees, and fines. Taxes are revenue measures. They don't have to bear any relationship to the taxed item at all. And fees have to bear some relationship to the service, and fines cannot be out of proportion to the charge. So I think it would be a opportunity here to characterize these things correctly as fines as opposed to fees, if the committee so chooses to amend that way. that's it for me.
Thank you, Elena. Next, I have up the police department. I don't know if you have anything further you'd like to add outside of the initial opening statement.
No, not at this time, sir.
No, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Next, we've got the fire department.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much. This is our Executive Assistant Chief Roman Clark, and the fire department stands behind their response to this bill, where we have no objections to it at all.
Thank you. And then next, we've got the Department of Housing and Community Development.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning. Stephanie Murdoch, Legislative Liaison for the Department of Housing and Community Development. I'm joined here today by Deputy Commissioner Jason Hessler of Permits and Litigation. DHCD appreciates the opportunity to report on City Council Bill 210050 and the administration's efforts to reduce the number of false alarms that officers respond to each year. The Baltimore City Code requires that alarm system contractors, monitors, and users register with DHCD's false alarm reduction program within 10 days of activation. A user is not charged any fees or registrations or renewals, and the process can be completed online. Alarm users are responsible for keeping their personal contact information accurate and the associated monitoring company's information up to date. Alarm registrations are not transferable from one alarm user to another or from one location to another. So this legislation would do a number of things. It would increase the fees assessed to residential alarm system users for repeated false alarms. It would lower the number of false alarms triggering a warning notice from after the 10th false alarm to after the 2nd false alarm, and decrease the number of additional false alarms warranting placement in no response status from 5 additional false alarms to 2 additional false alarms within that same 12-month period. And finally, the legislation would add an additional layer of verification of alarm signals by requiring that a second attempt be made to a different number if the first attempt fails, which codifies what is already required based on DHCD's false alarm rules and regulations. As others have said, false alarm activations are a major public safety concern, and DHCD supports the intent of the changes outlined in the bill. We recognize the strain that false alarm activations have on city resources and the need to continue to work with alarm system contractors, monitors, and users who also must do their part to ensure that contact information is accurate and up to date and that systems are functioning properly. DHCD defers to the police department on the passage of this bill, and we stand by to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, we have the Department of Finance.
Good afternoon, Mara James, Legislative Engagement Lead for the Department of Finance. We stand by our report. We support this legislation. As my colleagues have stated, this would increase efficiency for BPD in terms of addressing response times and responses to false alarms. In addition, I would like to reiterate some of what Elena said in terms of thinking about our fiscal impact statement. Again, since this is a fine, we looked more specifically at what was going on in jurisdictions surrounding the city and how they did this rather than doing a fee study. So we would support what Elena stated and the law department stated about clarifying that. In terms of our analysis on the fiscal impact, what this bill does is it increases fines and also creates a separate resident and non-resident user fine. What we saw from our research is that the increases are, while they're slightly higher than other jurisdictions, they aren't too extensive, and we think that they're very similar and stays in line with that. In addition, we think that that would be helpful considering the amount of false alarms that come from non-residential versus residential to have different fines there. I will also add in terms of just our analysis that in talking with HCD and BPD that the registration system as it is now, there's numerous users that just sit on that list and it can be burdensome for maintaining that. So just something to consider in terms of moving forward and discussing this would be possibly looking at the registration and how to update that. But obviously that's not a part of this bill right now. I just wanted to lift that up as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mara. We're going to jump into questions from the committee. And I want to start off with two very, very quick and dirty ones. The first one is a question to BPD. Can you give us a little insight on what this means to your operations, what this means to response time? How many calls are we talking today, and what we expect and change as a result of this policy?
That's a great question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So as part of our bill report, we provided some of these statistics for the committee's awareness. Overall, we saw in fiscal year 2019, that's the period from July 2018 through June 2019, about 18,000 of these alarm activations that occurred throughout the city. And we tried to categorize them in different buckets. And the bucket that we're really looking at is, have you had an alarm activation 5 or more times in that period of time? And for that, we saw 4,000 different activations occur in that period of time in that category. And so if this law, as it's currently being proposed, was put into place prior to that fiscal year starting, that would have been 4,000 alarm activations that we would not have been obligated to go to. And that would have freed up, thousands of hours of time for us. Each of these activations can take anywhere between 15, 20, in some cases 30 minutes, depending on how far it is from the unit that's responding. But each one represents what we call a code 2 priority, which is not the highest, but the second highest priority. We have to treat each one as though it's in an active burglary situation. But when we arrive, it turns out the unit that's doing the investigation determines that it was a faulty activation. And for that, as just, it really pulls on that resource. It's now committed to that code 2 emergency and not responding to a different code 2 emergency, which could also be something which is an active situation, albeit maybe not life-threatening, but an active situation. And so for us, it definitely has an impact. These are distributed throughout all the districts pretty evenly, actually. And so when we look at the numbers, every district is impacted this way and would receive relief in a way. And it really is, again, that burden on the officer. When you do the math, a couple of these activations, spread over the city, spread over the shifts that are there, we're talking 1 or 2 per person, seeing this on any given shift. And so for us, it's a big burden when you see these alarm activations. Anything we can do to change people's behavior, put light on this program, give folks the opportunity to really, get with a better alarm management behavior would really help in freeing up that call response time, which is really dependent upon availability of resources that are free in the field.
Sure, and just a follow-up to that question. So of course there's the officer physically going out there, but is there additional paperwork that comes with having to respond and verify that there's nothing wrong here?
It depends on the situation. Oftentimes there's interaction, of course, with the dispatcher as well. I don't want to forget our dispatcher corps, who does an amazing job. They have to treat each one of these, and that really ties up their availability to be able to get a call activated. It ties up their response on the same prioritization level as well. We tend to have an officer respond to a scene, and it may be a no response is needed after all, in which case they close the CAD, they go over the radio, so that the paperwork is not necessarily a problem or an issue unless there is a need to, in fact, file a report because there could have been a burglary. That happens in about 3 to 4% of cases when it comes to these activations. And so for us, it's not so much a paperwork issue, it is that time sink that really has an impact on our resource availability. But that's a good question.
Thank you. And then my second question has to do, as a follow-up to the note made by the law department about the difference between fines and fees. Does that at all have an impact on how we look at the sort of fee structure, as we call it here? I know it goes up pretty high, How do we think about that? Does that change anything?
Well, under the charter, the city cannot impose a fine of more than $1,000. So that is always going to be the upper limit. So these fines are consistent with that authority. So I don't see any problem enforcing them as they are.
Okay, thank you. Questions from the committee. I have Councilwoman Ramos. Floor is yours.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, committee, and also agency members. I have a couple of questions. I see this chart that the police department submitted, which was really helpful about, what these false alarms are, and that's, 18,000 is pretty substantial. And you had mentioned that you have district level data. I'd love to see it, frankly. So thank you for that. My question, I guess, is like, what's going on here? Why is it that there's so many false alarms? Is it a faulty system that then the homeowner and the company doesn't take care of? Is it a raccoon getting in the way? Like, there are raccoons in the city. I mean, I'm just trying to figure out, like, what is it that's happening here that we're trying to say, well, sorry, you're not going to get service anymore unless it's a 911 emergency.
Yeah, that's a great question, council member. I think the stories vary, and raccoon example is not a insubstantial example. A lot of it does have to do with faulty installations that are misactivating. I've heard stories about the train goes by and it rattles the house too much and it activates the alarm. And again, it's how a lot of these are installed as a big percentage of those false activations. The biggest thing that I want to highlight, though, is something that was mentioned by our folks at the housing department, and that is the two-call verification, right? And vendors that monitor these alarms have to be able to not call one number but two, and that's key because making sure they're compliant with that can really speak to what happens at the next stage. If it is an accidental activation, part of what the ordinance provides, the code provides, is that if you call it off before we show up, it doesn't hurt your numbers. It doesn't count against you. And the only way that can occur is if the alarm company never calls it into 911. That happens with frequency if they can't get a hold of the customer, if they can't get a hold of the person who owns the property to verify if it's actually an emergency or not. It's always the number we don't know. There could be a number of activations beyond 18,000 that we never even see record for. Why? Because the alarm company responsibly gets in touch with the alarm user and shuts it off before it even provides a 911 response. So, for us, there are varying reasons why activations occur that don't require police presence or response, but we respond to anyway. And again, we don't want there to be such a strict rule that we're never going to come. That's why 5 is a really good number for us. It gives folks the ability to get used to a new system, make sure they know it's installed properly, and it gives the user the opportunity to work with their alarm system company to make sure that it's configured properly and managed responsibly. That's a great question.
I appreciate that. I guess I'm just trying to, make sure that we're not, avoiding emergencies. And it sounds like you've come with, the 5 number as a result. And I don't know if the industry is going to testify later because I'll have some questions for them. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. And then the issue of fine versus fee. I didn't see that in your report, Mr. Petro, but it makes sense. So I guess we'll just have to figure out that solution at some point.
Madam Chair, Madam Councilwoman, I did do a supplemental report that I sent to Natwana and everybody. It probably just maybe didn't make it to everybody's desk,
Sure.
but hopefully they'll get it to you so you can have a bigger referral.
And thank you. And Mr. Chair, if you'll allow me, I just want to give a really great shout out to to Mr. Hessler and Ms. Murdoch and the housing team this morning. Reacted to a very strange situation in my district, and it's taken care of. So I want to just shout them out for a quick response. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Councilwoman Ramos. I see Nikki Thompson, you got your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a few questions based off of specifically the increase in fines in the waiver process. And I know we've talked about this already with the agency, so I'm really just asking more for follow-up on our end. Specifically, since we are increasing fines, have we been able to come to any conclusion on our ability to offer payment plans? I know that was a question that we raised in our meeting, but we were still trying to figure out if that was something we had the authority to institute.
If I, Mr. Chair, if I may, on the payment plan question?
Sure, please.
Okay, so, and thank you, Nikki, for raising this. And I know we did discuss this a bit, and we went back and also talked with the agencies about this payment plan as well. I'm kind of following in line from the law department's assessment that this is a fine and not a fee. Part of the reasons for us to do these changes were to ensure that we're encouraging changes in behavior, with the overall goal being to help reduce these false alarm charges. Or I'm sorry, these false alarm calls. So under the current law, the fines went from $50 up to $2,000 if you had 15 plus false alarms. And so as part of our work on this, we cut that down to that the fines are reduced, and we only go up to those 5 false alarms being fined. So in the past, people would be fined on, false alarm number 10 and receive like $400 and up to $1,000 at false alarm 12. So in a sense, this is reducing the amount of money on an individual fine because you're not being fined after that 5th alarm. What we're doing is putting you on that no response list so that we're saving those resources. And we just, so in terms of the payment plan, the fine is just one of the ways in which we could help encourage people to be in compliance with this law. We do waive the first fine. There's language in the current law that does allow for people, that are going on this false alarm, this no response list, to work with their alarm company to have the problem fixed, because ultimately that's the goal. The goal is to make sure that people are sufficiently encouraged to get the problem fixed so that there aren't multiple false alarms. So we just feel that using a payment plan on this, when the fees are less, the individual fees aren't less now, but the overall scope of fees that someone could be charged is less than what was allowed in the past. It's just important to have some sort of mechanism there to encourage people to comply with the fine. And so having a payment plan may water down that compliance, especially since they aren't being charged after the 5th. After the 5th fine, they're just placed on the no response list and aren't being continuously charged escalating fees.
Thank you. So that, I guess, brings me to perfectly tailored to my next question about the waiver process. If you could walk through, I guess, how the waiver process is supposed to be set up. I know in our prior conversations, we were wanting to make sure that it was a full and waiver. So if we could just walk through how it's supposed to work and should work.
Okay, and I will ask that housing also weigh in, since they implement some of this process, just for additional details. But right now we would have it so that there is a notification after the 2nd false alarm that with the 5th false alarm, you would go on a 5th false alarm within 12-month period, you would go on this no response list. And that after 5 or more false alarms, you could be reinstated by submitting a written application to the housing commissioner. And the commissioner may then reinstate the alarm system only if they receive that reinstatement and the individual has taken some steps to have the alarm system repaired, upgraded, or replaced.
Yeah, that's correct, Natasha. One false alarm occurrence fee will be waived if the alarm user has the alarm system inspected by the register alarm company and provides certification that the alarm system has been inspected and is functioning properly, excuse me. And Jason also may be able to speak to that as well, if that does not satisfy the question.
Oh, no, great answer. Thank you so much.
Councilwoman, actually, let me check to make sure before I go back to you, Councilwoman Ramos. Any other questions from folks on the committee? Seeing no questions, Councilwoman Ramos.
Thank you. So I should have realized this when I asked my earlier question. Fine versus fee. People can't go to tax sale over this, right? No? Okay.
Yeah.
They're not, it's not on the, it doesn't go as a citation or anything like that. That would be added to the lien.
I don't think it's a lienable thing. Well, I think that's, I'd have to look at it. I'd have to look at it.
The false alarm, this is Jason Hessler from the Department of Housing.
Good.
The false alarm, currently the false alarm fees do not, are not a lien on the property and do not go to tax sale. If there's, we do issue citations to monitor companies as well as users for not registering, and those citations are, if they're issued to the property owner, would be a lienable offense.
Okay, but if we change the language from fine to fee, that's not going to make a difference there. Okay, thank you.
None of the changes here make any changes to that.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that clarity. The next one, if you don't mind, Mr. Chair, are we seeing? So the 18,000 that were the false alarms, those were all registered, and if so, are we seeing where like somebody kind of just moved in and is trying to figure out the alarm system? You know what? I'm just trying to get a sense of what we're actually talking about here.
Yeah, again, so part of the data that we provided, you'll see that the instances of addresses where there's only one activation, it's about 6,800 alarms. And, you know, that's part of what you just described. It's a new user, they're getting familiar with the system. You know, they tried to make sure that they're called off, but for whatever reason, it didn't get back to the unit fast enough to prevent a police response. And so for us, you know, everything that's in front of you, there's a disposition, which means we responded to it. It's a call in the CAD, and it did result in some kind of dispatch by our personnel. And so, you know, that's a clear example of something where we don't want there to be a fine for the first one. That's an honest mistake, and there isn't a fine for the first time. And if there is something that's not at the fault of the alarm user, per the guidelines, you can get that waived, and it gets off of your record as though it never occurred. And so for us, you know, we want to give people as many chances as are reasonable. But right now, 15 chances is a lot of chances. And if you look at other jurisdictions, you'll see it ranges between 3 to 4 to even 6 at the most. But for us, we think that 5 number is a much more, you know, in line with best practices compared to other jurisdictions, other major cities that have very similar false alarm programs.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Any other questions from the committee? Seeing no further questions, we're going to move on to testimony. So the committee will now take on public testimony. We'll get the directions up here in a moment. So committee staff will coordinate the public testimony. Please be patient. If you are connecting online, please use the raise hand function to indicate that you wish to testify. Each speaker must state their name prior to speaking. Users who call in cannot be identified by name will be unmuted by the host one by one. If you do not wish to testify, please say so when you're unmuted. Attendees will hear 2 beeps when they are unmuted. Please state your name at the beginning of your testimony. If a speaker is inaudible, they will be directed to call back or to provide their testimony in the chat function. So with that, if you would like to testify on this bill, please use the raise hand function on the bottom right of the WebEx. Okay, seeing no testimony, do we have any testimony on the phone line? Okay, we've got 2 callers. I'm gonna unmute the first one. Hello, do you have any testimony?
No, I do not.
Thank you. Hello, do you have any testimony? Okay, with that, we're not going to vote on this today. We're going to hold a voting session at a later date, and so this bill will go on a recess, and we're going to take a 2-minute recess and start back up at 1:40 for the next bill on facial recognition. Thank you.